We've all heard from the world's leading biopharmaceutical and biotech companies really telling us about the future, discovery, innovation, which has been incredibly exciting. And I'm pleased to say that the next session is going to be no exception to that. So if you just need to take a break, please come back very quickly. So our fireside chat, our participant is Dr. David Reese, who's the first ever Chief Technology Officer at Amgen. He was former head for R&D at Amgen and receiving approvals for worldwide for innovative medicines and biosimilars, and obviously, as we all know, developing a robust pipeline for potential new treatments. I'm also delighted to welcome one of my colleagues, Dr. Calum MacRae, who does many things, amongst which he's a faculty member at MGB, a cardiologist, professor of medicine at Harvard Med School, and the principal investigator of the Apple Health Study. So with no further ado, I really look forward to this session. I'm going to welcome David and Calum to the stage, and please, as I say, stick around because this is going to be as fascinating as the rest of this meeting. Thank you.
So, David, thank you very much for doing this. I think at this critical juncture in biomedical sciences, it's really exciting to think about what the future will look like, in particular with people who have already begun to build that future. As Chris mentioned and Giles mentioned, you're the first ever executive VP and Chief Technology Officer at Amgen. And when I first met you many years ago before COVID, you were the Chief Scientific Officer. How did you envisage this role? What were the forces that drove this combination of tech and AI across the company? And how do you see that evolve?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's been a terrific conference so far. It's just a wonderful mix that we have every year at the Innovation Forum. You know, the genesis of this role dates back almost a decade. And, you know, we had started talking internally. I started using the phrase hinge moment. It's used for many things right now, but at that point in time, it had a very specific definition, meaning, you know, the union of technology and biotechnology, and we could sense that coming. And then if you fast forward to 2 or 3 years ago, it was very clear now that that's starting to become a reality, and we realized that we wanted to create an organization that actually would help propel Amgen through the hinge moment. And so what we did is a couple things that are so far, to my knowledge, unique in the industry, certainly among larger companies, was we put our medical organization, in other words, the organization under our chief medical officer, together with our technology organization, the IT organization, saying if you believe you're in the hinge moment, you're going to create a structure that actually allows that organization to move through it. We then created a third vertical focused on artificial intelligence and data science, and have recruited a terrific leader for that. So this really grew out of that sort of bone marrow belief that hinge moment is here, and it's our belief, and all of this is predicated on the notion that this new technology we think is going to permeate every nook and cranny of our business. This is not just R&D facing, this is discovery biology, target biology, manufacturing, all facets of commercialization.
Now, that end-to-end sort of closed loop strategy, right, when you first started doing this was really almost a theoretical idea. In the last 5 years, you've seen, you know, massive changes in the application of technology and AI in the rest of our lives. How has that influenced the way your role has evolved in the company, or has it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you have to have when you're in this kind of role, or you're doing what we're doing in general right now, is the ability to understand that what you're doing a year from now is going to be different. Because the world is very fluid. And there's no doubt this role will evolve over time. Is it exactly as I conceived it 18 months ago when we announced it? Of course not. When we put put the medical and technology organizations together, the first thing we had to do was create a common language, because they kind of speak French and German in a certain way. And, but now we're well past that. We don't think about that anymore, and we're really seeing those kinds of synergies that we wanted when you put these kinds of folks together.
So much of the way in which you can build models, you can drive technology through any organization is really the architecture and the data that you're collecting. I think as we've seen over the last couple of years, a lot of the actual underlying analytic tools are commoditized, and you need to think about how you're collecting the right data.
Yeah.
How much re-engineering of the architecture, as you mentioned, of the manufacturing part of the organization, the basic discovery parts of the organization, how did you think about that strategically?
Well, that's a work in progress, and it is for everyone. But I think you've hit on what is a critical notion, which is, the differentiator here, I believe, will be, your data and your proprietary data combined with what you know, your know-how, and then using a bunch of tools. Arguing about whether one tool is slightly better than another tool is a waste of time. But understanding how your data is architected, what data is actually worth it. Because we have 45 years worth of protein engineering data. Some of that is really worth extracting, and some is not. So that's what we're working on right now, figuring that out. And then certainly at this moment going forward, you want to create an architecture where everything is AI ready and ready to be plugged into models. I mean, to me, that is just essential. It's not an easy task.
That's what I was going to say. It's sort of building an organization where everything's computable at source is
Exactly.
quite a lot of culture change. How are you managing that while the plane is
Yeah,
in the
that's a
air,
great
as it were?
question. And what we call change management is it may be the most important part of the game. That you can change the technology, but until you change the people and how they're thinking about it, you're really not going to see any return on investment. So we're investing a lot of thought into that. When I was talking to our board of directors about this whole notion of what this organization would look like and what we thought we could do in the future, it was really both of those pieces. And I said, let's just start with a simple thought experiment. If we have the same technology and the same workforce in a decade, are we going to be successful? Well, of course, the answer is obvious. So then the only question is, okay, what do you do? What do you do? And that's what really gave birth to the effort that we're making.
Just to clarify this from my standpoint, do individual heads of each of the components of the organization have data metrics as well as other metrics, or are you imagining that this is operating sort of pervasively underneath all of them?
It'll be a combination of both. It'll be a combination of both.
So just to change topics a little bit, sort of tech and bio for a long time have been like oil and water. What do you think are the biggest technical challenges in getting biologists to essentially structure the way that they work, the data they produce, at the right scale to drive modeling? How is that played out?
I think most of them are interested in that, and most of them actually understand that this is the future. So it's how do you create an underlying, technology infrastructure that enables them. To me, the shorthand has become, artificial intelligence won't replace a chemist, but a chemist with artificial intelligence is for sure replacing chemists as we speak. And so it's going to be those folks who are self-starters, who have an innate curiosity. When I'm looking for leaders, our CEO and I talk about this a lot, because this is something where you have to kind of get in the muck and practice and learn just to understand how to ask the right questions. And we need that from leaders at a relatively senior level now, as well as throughout the organization.
So one of the things that struck me hearing what you were doing was that a lot of your competitors, a lot of the investment in the biotechnology space has been in essentially matching small molecules or biologic epitopes to a molecular target. You're thinking much downstream of that, all the way through to processing.
Of course, so target identification is important, and we're investing a lot in that with new technology. Molecular engineering, obviously in protein therapeutics, is actually in front of small molecules there because it's actually technically a little more tractable in the post-AlphaFold world that we live in. But most folks don't understand that once we've solved all of that, we're like 3% of the way to actually having a drug. And what you need to do to then get that into a formulation and be able to put it into humans is quite complex. Let me bring us out of the theoretical and give you a simple example. One of the things that we care about if we're developing a protein therapeutic, that let's say we want something that a patient can self-inject in an auto-injector a couple times a month or once a month. Well, it has to be formulated and fit within a certain relatively narrow viscosity range. Too thick, doesn't go in, causes severe injection site reactions. Too thin, of course I'm using simple terms here, too thin, the proteins fall apart or they aggregate, all kinds of bad things happen. And in the old days, 2 years ago, the only way to determine whether a candidate molecule, let's say a plain vanilla antibody, would fit within that window was to do it empirically. So we generate hundreds and hundreds of antibodies against a target, start screening them, winnow out those that don't fit, rounds of molecular engineering to ultimately arrive at a clinical candidate. Well, we took all of the data we had amassed now over decades and created a machine learning algorithm that now, with enough accuracy, will tell us which molecules are going to fit within that viscosity range and which we can simply discard and not waste time on. So it's not a sexy problem. You're not going to read headlines in the New York Times about that. It's one molecular attribute. We've mapped 15 or 20 more, so now you can now see line of sight to where you solve those problems one by one in silico, and all of a sudden you're taking them years off a preclinical development timeline. There's not a big bang moment, but it's an accretion of successes, and that's what we're really striving for.
Yeah, that's very clear. I think one of the things that I was thinking as I was looking at the scope of what you're doing is where have you seen the biggest impact to date across the whole sort of range of the company? Where do you think is the...
molecular engineering I've discussed. That's clearly a big impact. In some of our newest manufacturing plants in Ohio, in North Carolina, they are heavily infused with technology. I'll give you another example. It's an FDA requirement that when a batch of drug product goes down a line, after that batch run is complete, the line has to be cleared. There can't be debris, there can't be other things that might compromise sterility, for example. These are hypersterile environments. And that's, historically that's been done manually. Took half an hour or so to clear the line. Using cameras that then are trained, that train AI algorithms, we can now direct staff immediately to an area where there may be a problem, fix it. It takes now about 2 minutes to clear the line versus 30 to 35. Well, what does that mean? Many extra days of production over the course of the year. Again, nothing that's going to garner a headline, but it changes the economics of the business, ultimately what you may be able to charge for drugs, how we think about manufacturing, and that's one example. Again, now you layer in one after another of these in manufacturing plants, and all of a sudden you've got a new ecosystem.
So one of the areas I think that AI's struggled with, although I think it's getting better, is patient identification, patient matching, both for clinical trials and for implementation. Do you have a sense of why that was, and do you see how your strategy is going to overcome some of that?
Yeah, I think some of the initial models probably weren't just quite sophisticated enough. We have created an algorithm that we call Atomic. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but that's one of the problems when you have 10,000 acronyms in your organization. But it doesn't select patients, but it selects sites. Which sites are most likely to enroll to a clinical trial? When I was the head of R&D, when you're an R&D head, the single biggest line item in your budget is the cost of mid and late stage clinical trials, of course. And the most important variable affecting that cost is the rate of enrollment. And so if you can change that, you can change the equation. And so we developed this algorithm, based on many years worth of data that predicts which sites are most likely to enroll the most patients. And, we now apply it across, it's now up to roughly 80% of the portfolio. Soon it will be the entire portfolio. And those sites enroll up to 3 times as many patients as sites selected the traditional way. In the clinical trials arena, that's a massive increment in productivity.
As you look across the sort of full horizon, where do you see the biggest impact in the long term? And I suppose part of that is, what do you think is the effect of, if you add all these accretive possibilities together, including the big impact components, what do you think is the influence on the cost of developing a drug or the margin for developing it?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've been talking for a long time. When I became head of R&D, I said, look, and this is not a mystery to anyone, there are 2 existential problems facing all of us. One is the success rate.
Yep.
8% of drugs that go into the clinic roughly make it across the finish line. We have to do better than that to remain economically viable. And second is what we call the cycle time. Still 10 to 14 years on average from an idea in the laboratory to an FDA approval. If you can cut that in half, you have a dramatic effect on the business. So I think, here's where we want to load the dice and change. I used to tell my son that, that if I failed 80% of the time, I'd be the greatest ever by a mile, by a mile. And so if we could just fail 80% of the time, we completely change the model of drug development.
I think that's a really important point. I don't think people recognize just how modest an increment it would take to really transform discovery.
People are looking for, perfection.
Yeah.
And, when we created this organization, one of the guiding principles that I instilled is, look, we're going to pick a dozen or 15 big things, and we're going to go after them. That's success, where it moves the needle for our patients and our company, and in some cases, the field. Not 200 pilot projects that are really interesting, but don't end up scaling and don't end up moving the needle. And so that's what we use to guide resource allocation. In fact, we created a new governance board to enforce that I co-chair with our chief financial officer. So you've got the technical assessment and you got the money.
Yes.
And that's a powerful combination.
Always important to map the money. So speaking of that, I mean, there are a lot of entrepreneurs and investors come to the conference. What do you think are the gaps in biopharma where you would, if you were an investor, put your money that real change is necessary and might happen?
Everything that I've discussed. I mean, we're in early innings.
You don't think there's any sort of unique...
well, if I did, I wouldn't tell you.
No, exactly. That's true. That is a good point.
But
you would have told me before we came on.
I would have, maybe in private, but not among friends here. But look, cross that entire value chain. To me, the ultimate prize here actually is disease biology.
Yeah.
What I think is really exciting. We at Amgen Decode Genetics, we have about 300 petabytes of human data. We installed an NVIDIA supercomputer on site. And we're now, we've developed models really looking at targets and pathways. Think about a disease like lupus. We know that it must be multiple diseases on a molecular level. Just the way breast cancer or lymphoma now we can very precisely categorize, because the clinical manifestations are very distinct in different patients. But you've got a problem with an enormous number of variables. You've got 24 rheostats in the immune system that are being dialed up and down on a genetic background in the context of environmental exposures or influences. And so I think the only way that problem becomes tractable is with this kind of computing power. And so that's what I'd like to understand. And then that points you to the development of therapeutics.
Right. And in some ways, that's almost, I think, as you said when we were preparing for this, a convergence of lots of different industries rather than just
Absolutely.
biopharma.
I mean, I hired and recruited a head of artificial intelligence and data sciences who ran data and analytics for Nike. Not a traditional recruiting stop, for a company like Amgen. And he, the person who is the head of artificial intelligence under him, someone who was at Flatiron, but before that, if you've got a Spotify feed, you're using his algorithm. He built those algorithms. And so, I think that's one lesson for all of us, is that the talent we need to draw on in this world now, you have to have a very, very wide aperture.
You mentioned disease biology. I'm imagining and seeing this around the industry as we look broadly, that a lot of pharma and biopharma companies are starting to interact more directly with patients. How do you see technology, AI, and that type of change in the way in which industry is interacting directly with the customer? Changing.
I think we're certainly at a moment of change. We're probably just in the first baby steps. And it's got to be done compliantly. It's got to be done according to regulations. But it's inconceivable to me that in 10 or 15 years we'll be interacting with physicians and patients in the same way that we are now. They won't stand for it. If anything else, the demand side will change what has to happen.
That actually is, I think, an important thing that we sometimes don't see from our standpoint.
They have a voice here.
Yeah, they have a voice. They have a real voice. When do you think, so again, you've, I think, very eloquently described what ends up being a truly closed loop model, but the missing piece, as you said, is the clinical information coming back in to drive the target ID. When do you think we're going to see a really definitive, large biological model, if you will, in artificial intelligence?
I think it's coming right now. What you have to do, think about the early years of the internet and when the bust occurred. Something really important was done, which was the laying of fiber optic cable. And then things went bust, but that cable never went anywhere. And a few years later, it became incredibly important, and now it powers our entire economy, by and large. And so right now, we're in that pipe or cable laying phase. And so a lot of what I think about every day is, what is that infrastructure, that hardcore infrastructure that we need so that the person who succeeds me, I always ask myself, what are they going to wake up one day, 5 or 10 years from now or whenever, and say, gosh, I wish he would have done that. And those are the things that we have to be thinking about. Those are hard questions to ask yourself.
I totally agree. Dave, so to round it out, I would love to know, what do you wish you would do next? What do you see as the next step in what you're thinking about with the platform?
Some of my team are sitting here in the front row, and they'll know I never received a performance evaluation that said he's gifted with patience. And, so I think it's a lot. I'd just like to see it move more quickly. And so I also spend a lot of my time thinking about, how do we move more quickly? If we really level up for a minute, one of the key questions I think you have to ask is not how do we do what we're doing better, but should we be doing it at all? Or should it simply be eliminated? And there's a whole field of study called process design, which is going to be being revolutionized by artificial intelligence and machine learning. And it is going to change huge swaths of this economy, including drug discovery and drug development. I think being open to that. When I took this role, one of the first things I did is I called people around the world in different industries, mostly not in pharma, because I knew what they had to say, all my friends. But, and where I learned the most, oil and gas and the automotive industry, where they have been working on these employment of these technologies for a long time. I talked to a CTO, said, look, I've got, 10,000 gas fields and oil wells and hundreds of tankers every day. They have to have these sorts of models to keep, and I have to now build in geopolitical instability to the models. And so I think we also, if you're in one of these kinds of jobs, approach it with real humility, that there's a lot to learn from other parts of the world that you may not necessarily think of.
I think that's always a fantastic lesson. Thank you very much for A, sponsoring the forum, and B, coming to tell us about your, I think, unique approach at Amgen. So thank you very much, Dave.
It's been such a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.